Hi everyone, good morning, frosty Monday morning. Welcome to the Childhood and Society Sign seminar series. This is the final one of this term and they'll start again in January. So I'm absolutely delighted to have John and Nathan present their very current and live research with parents and on the issue of activism and educational activism. So it's a fantastic opportunity to hear their work and for us to learn about what our colleagues are doing across the departments, and that is the objective of the seminar series. So I would really welcome all of you to put forward an abstract, a title. Just get in touch with me as I'm starting to pull together next year's seminar series, and I want to have as many of you present as possible and not too much of me, ideally. So I'm not going to take up too much more space. Just suffice to say that I'm just really, really thrilled that this is the seminar that concludes this year's series, because it's just such important work, and we all have so much to learn from Nathan and John and their research. So I'm going to hand over right now. So you'll have about 40 minutes or so. Take what you need, really. And then we'll have whatever time is remaining for question and answer. So if as we're going along, everyone could just pop their questions, comments, reflections into the chat, and I will gather them up and field them towards the end of the session. And yeah, just enjoy the session. If you can make sure you're on mute so there's no interference from sounds that shouldn't be there, and enjoy the session.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, everybody, for coming and listening to our little presentation. This is, let's say, a condensed or distilled version of a chapter that we've written for an edited collection. It's currently going through submission yet, so it's going to be a while before it's out. But the collection is Reinventing the Family in Uncertain Times, and the editors are Marie-Pierre Moreau and some of her colleagues at the University of East Anglia. So this is a distilled version of the chapter that we've just written. And essentially, it's about what happens to parents who buck the system. It's about what happens to parents who challenge and say no. It's about what happens to parents who refuse to accept the demands of authority and the kind of policy developments that affect their families and communities. And throughout the slides, you'll see pictures in the background here. These, bar one of Axel Honneth, the social theorist Axel Honneth, the rest of them are actually images that were taken through observations at some of these parents, some of these campaigns, events. So without further ado, I want to begin by talking about the kind of the framing. Our argument basically is that there are, since at least the 1980s, there has been normative pressures exerted through policy and practice around parenting to create or construct or enjoin parents to become more active and involved in their children's education. We see these through notions of school choice and so on and so forth. So these normative discourses of active and involved parenting, and these obviously cause pressures for parents and so on, living up to the ideal. And our argument is basically that, parents are expected to be active, but not too active. That when they step over that boundary, then problems start to emerge. So as we've got here on the slides, we see this construction of active and involved parenting shaped around several different areas. First, we have notions of school choice and patterns of consumption in education. So parents are meant to be active in selecting their children's schools and so on and so forth. And also, and this is probably the most prominent aspect of it with relation to parents and school engagement, is the pressures on parents to become more directly involved in their children's education. So notions of parental involvement or parental engagement. And throughout this paper, this presentation, we use the term parental involvement, but we use it in the extended sense in terms of both involvement in and with schools on one hand, and also engagement in at-home learning on the other. So parents are enjoined to become consumers of educational services, exercising choice. They're meant to be providing support for children and working with schools in terms of parental involvement. And at home, we have these notions of school readiness, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. And this idea that the home is no longer simply a home, it's a home learning environment. So right from the early years, parents are expecting to be cultivating home learning, their home as a home learning environment, and ensuring that the children are school ready and so on. So these are some of the prominent ways, I think, in which this, or the kind of axes around which this notion of active and involved parenting is constructed. But what these tend to do as well, and the way that this normative ideal is constructed, tends to emphasize individualism. So it's about the pursuit of family advantage, and there's an instrumentalist kind of sense behind all of this. So you work with your children, you support your children, you improve, you're actively involved and engaged in their education, you make sensible, wise choices with a view to maximizing their future potential, giving them positional advantage, and so on and so forth. And it also obviously places a great deal of responsibility on parents. So we can see this as part of a wider set of perhaps neoliberal, if we want to call it that, but neoliberal discourses of responsibilization as well. So there's these two tracks of instrumentalization and individualism, and the way that it generates and expects parents to become more responsible. And I think this quote, I always turn back to this quote from Allen's early intervention report, the first one, 2011, in 2011. And this phrase, I think you can find evidence for it appearing from at least the 1988 Act and so on. This idea that what parents do is more important than who they are. Now, look, there are a whole host of issues around this notion, the way that it kind of masks the structural conditions and so on, and structural inequalities that families face. And there's a lot that can be said about that critically, and some of my own research does address this. But what I want to home in on here is this idea that it's about what parents do. They are expected to be active, but they are expected to be active in particular kinds of ways. So this is something of a mantra that we see reappearing across policy documents. So these norms of active parenting tend then, so this idea of what parents do as mattering, they tend to privilege the individual family unit. So families and parents are treated as if they are isolated individuals, and obviously they're meant to secure their own family's advantage. We don't see in policy any genuine consideration of parents as a collective within particular schools, or more nationally or whatever, and hence there's no consideration of parents' collective rights or interests. As many people have put on, as many people have mentioned, and I've just put on just one reference here, but Crowley's work, these norms of active parenting, and particularly around notions around parental involvement in education, tend to be modeled on white middle-class parenting practices. So there's exclusions, forms of exclusions already built into the way, the public way that parental involvement is considered. And this is really important for us, and it also connects up to that preceding point, but it is now very narrow. This idea of parental involvement or norms of active and involved parenting tend to be narrowly circumscribed. Okay, there are certain things that parents are enjoined to do, but there are other forms of engagement involvement that are not sanctioned. So we often, as Crowley points out, the involvement of working class parents or parents from minoritized backgrounds is often represented or misrecognized or misrepresented and seen to be being problematic or troublesome and so on and so forth. And this is what Crowley, in an earlier piece of work, seems that parental involvement tends to actually favour the status quo. what the schools want or what policymakers want is encouraging parents to make sure the children do their homework, getting the children in on time, making wise choices about the school that they attend, not to actually confront and challenge the way that the schools operate. Okay, to do so is to be seen in more pathological terms as a problem parent, as a troublesome parent, and so on and so forth. So our argument here is that we have this context of normative pressures for parents to be active, but we want to explore the experiences of what happens when parents do become really active and really involved and try to shape educational policy and practice. And so hence, this is why we're interested in the parental activism aspect of it. And we see activism, and it doesn't necessarily have to always be very overt and banner waving and protest. There can be more, as people like Pottinger, Horton and Craftel point out, there can be more forms of quiet activism and subversion. But we see it generally as any attempt to take action, whether individually or collectively, to secure some kind of institutional or political change. And there can be various different tactics, strategies, practices around activism. But not many people, there's, particularly within the UK, there's very little scholarly attention or interest that's been directed at parental activism around education. There is some literature in the wider context, primarily or predominantly in the US, so stretching over the last 20 years or so. So there is a body of literature there, but nobody's really examined it in the UK. There are some exceptions, and the most important of which is, I would argue, is Vincent's work, Including Parents, the book Including Parents from the year 2000, okay? And that is the most extensive treatment that we find in the British context. There are others like Sibley White and Stevenson. But the situation has changed significantly since the time that Vincent was writing, okay? And so one of the things she says is that parental activism appears to be quite uncommon. Well, anybody who follows the media will see that, particularly over the last decade, and this is one of the reasons why we started exploring it as a topic, there have been a whole raft of different, around different areas, but a whole raft of parental activism around education. I think one of the reasons for this development is social media and the growth of social media, okay? It makes it easier for activists to organize. It makes it easier for activists to promote their campaign and draw attention to issues. But also we've had further marketization around the real pushing of academies and free schools. I think there's been a greater emphasis on high stakes testing and a concomitant narrowing of school curricula that come with it. And also under austerity, we've obviously had a significant pressures placed on educational budgets and significant cuts to education budgets. And I think around all of these, and we can trace these in the media, not cited any examples here, but we can see that there have been quite a few campaigns that have emerged around all of these kind of issues. So I think the last 20 years, certainly since Vincent was writing, parental activism around educational issues has become much more prominent. And I think it's an important phenomenon that we need to explore in more detail, because it's about civic engagement in education, essentially. So, John, can I pass over to you?
Cool, thanks Nathan, thank you. So I'm going to talk briefly about the methods and the approaches that we did in our first chance of data collection, which we kind of did 2018, 2019. The basis of it was a series of semi-structured interviews and focus groups, mostly with parent activists and also campaign advocates as well. And as Nathan said, that's kind of been supplemented by a number of observations of watching kind of rallies and some of their campaigns when they went out into very kind of public spaces. So I think that's Parliament Square there that we see kind of in the background. One of the things to say about these research encounters is how lengthy most of the conversations we had with parent activists. We've talked about this in a previous kind of presentation that we've done. But the interviews were 2 hours, 2.5 hours often. They were very emotionally charged. Talking to activists by nature ends up being a very emotionally charged kind of encounter. Where lots of activists, and you'll see some of these examples in the quotes, you can see the passion coming through, you can see the anger and the rage coming through in the way that they're talking about their experiences. So, as usual, the ethical approval was secured in advance. When we're talking about things today, we're using pseudonyms for participants, for the campaign groups, and also for the locations in which they're based. So, folks, we've got 3 case studies that we're going to be looking at. One of the campaigns we were looking at, we've called Protect Children's Education. A group of people formed in 2017 to oppose the national education funding cuts that have been proposed. They worked online. There was an awful lot of social media kind of activism that was online, but they also did more traditional methods in terms of putting posters up outside schools and getting parents involved at the school gate and those kinds of things. It actually developed into a really big network of different groups that was under this branding. But for the research where me and Nathan talked to these people, it was based in a city in the south of England. One of the things that people often say to me is, how successful were these campaigns? Did they win? And win is a really difficult thing to talk about in relation to these campaigns. The Protect Children's Education, they still have a social media presence. It has been much reduced through COVID and those kinds of things. But they were really successful in breaking through different sets of scales, breaking through into the national media to kind of make the messages heard much more publicly. The other 2 case studies we've got are a much more kind of local based set of parents who got together to campaign against the academisation of primary schools. So the second one is East Borough, we've called it. That also was established in 2017 to try and bring together lots of different strands of people who were against who were in opposition to the academisation of all primary schools in one London borough. There were parents that came together, parents who often didn't have any experiences of even having conversations with head teachers, let alone starting to contest some of the things that head teachers may have said. It also involved people from teaching union and other kind of really established activists all coming together. There were 3 schools that were facing imminent threat of conversion. Through this East Borough kind of campaign, 2 of those schools eventually were not turned into academies, and the local authority said it was going to desist from that process of academising the local schools in that area. So that's some of the successes from that one. The third one we've called Crowley Parents Campaign, and that was parents again coming together to fight against a particular campaign against becoming academies. This one wasn't so successful in that the school eventually did become an academy, but the absolutely very long process that went on was challenged all the way through the system at every single possible kind of moment. And so their success in a way has been providing a framework and ground print for other people who are also trying to contest academisation. So 3 different case studies, 3 different processes, 3 different ways in which they were kind of successful.
Thanks, John. I think one of the things that I think is really important to point out from our research is when Vincent undertook her original study over 2 decades ago, I've already mentioned that she thought at the time that parental activism was an uncommon phenomenon, but she also discusses and concludes that they the campaigns that she studied tended to be focused around individual interests. They tended to serve the benefits of a certain, either some families or a fraction of families, rather than having a more universal outlook. And I think actually within our data, and this is important, we see a much closer binding between universal and particular campaigns. And I think through this lens and seeing this, we start to see the way that collective parental involvement, collective parental activism, challenges the kind of neoliberalism, the individualism and instrumentalism that's implied within the kind of neoliberal discourses around active and involved parenting. And I also think in this way, Sibley White's study focused on Let Our Kids Be Kids, the school's testing campaign. And she says, because the parents actually didn't go through with their strike and taking the kids out of school, it ultimately remains complicit with that kind of broader neoliberal logic about the importance of testing and so on and so forth. I think with our data, we see a much more radical challenge to the kind of neoliberal orthodoxy that underpins this discourse of active and involved parenting. And now we get on to looking at some of the data around this. Okay, I'm just looking where they are. Is this you, John?
Yeah, I'll talk about this quote. We have quite long quotes here, but they are interesting and they're fascinating. And this one, I think, really tells you something about this particular campaign. The PCE one was the one that was the national campaign against funding cuts. And one of the kind of key people driving this, Lynn, she says, the desire to make a change, desire to make a difference, desire to do something not for my children, because they're going to be okay. And she talks about some of the ways in which, you know, she can support the education, the learning, the experiences of her children. But then she says, but most families can't. And so this is for a campaign that's saying, actually, every child matters. And we're doing this for the community, not for ourselves. And it's that passion, that drive to change something. So this is a really good example of what Nathan was saying about that moving beyond the individualism. These campaigns moved beyond that, the self-centeredness, moved beyond the kind of neoliberal kind of approaches. We see the notion of community here. We see collectivity as a kind of a set of ideas for why these parents feel so motivated to take part in the campaign. And interestingly, this was the campaign which was operating at a much broader scale. So it did involve working in local schools, but it did kind of scale up to be a much more kind of powerful, broader kind of force for change at that more kind of national kind of level almost. And it was using...
Sorry, John.
No, carry on.
I was just going to say, and it's important to think here, when we'll discuss this a bit later on, but the target of this campaign is obviously central government, national government. So it's not focused on the local issues in the same way as the anti-academisation campaigns are. Do you want me to move on? Okay. So I think in the previous example that John's just outlined, we really see, you know, it's probably the most clearly and directly altruistic of the three campaigns. But we also see in the anti-academisation campaigns this binding of universal and particular concerns. Now, in the anti-academy campaigns, parents were clearly concerned and anxious about the impact that academisation might have for their children's education. They were clearly motivated by that. So there is an individual aspect to it, that concern, self-interest and so on. But they were all, that tended to be framed in terms as well of its impact on the community, on the collective of parents at these schools, and also, like I say, around the wider community as well, outside of the school gates. And for the EAC campaign, for the Eastborough campaign in particular, this anxiety about the academisation of schools within the borough translated into a much wider opposition towards the very principle of academisation. And as Floyd points out here, this becomes an issue about who gets to have a say in education, who gets to have a say over the way that schools and the way that the education system is run. And Floyd makes a very clear linkage here between, you know, democratic politics, deliberation, and being able for parents to being able to contribute and to challenge and to be able to, for communities to determine their educational futures, so to speak. So we see here how for campaigners like Floyd in the Eastborough campaign, concern about academisation within that school, within that borough, becomes harnessed into a kind of an argument for greater parental participation and greater community involvement in schools more generally. We also see this in the Crowley campaign as well. Although, and I have to be clear here, the two lead campaigners were quite adamant that they were not opposed to academisation per se. So it didn't translate into a wider opposition. They just wanted to make sure that the school, the trust that was coming over to take over the school was the right trust for them. And we see it here. As one of the other campaigners puts it, when I want a new car, I don't go and buy a worse car, do I? So they, through their forensic analysis, they really unpacked and explored what it would entail and what this trust was that was coming in. But I think even here in the case of CPC, it becomes framed as a whole school issue, an issue for the community. It's not just particular sets of parents, okay, a particular fraction of parents, but it also becomes framed in part as a demand for greater parental say over what happens to your children's school, greater parental participation. And so I think, again, we see this binding of the individual and collective. Okay, but look, it is clear that parents had something to gain from campaigning, right? Okay, in terms, at least if the campaigns were successful. You get additional funding, great, that benefits my child. You stop academisation, great. Okay, we got what we wanted, that's better for my child. So there is an element of self-interest here, obviously, but I don't think it can be, we can see the campaigns as being motivated primarily by self-interest. I think in all the campaigns that we studied, and it's across the data, this sense that it's about parents as a whole, the community as a whole, we're doing it not just for ourselves, but for others. So I think we see that binding of self-interest and altruism cutting through and across all of our data, actually. And also, once you start, if we think about the discourses of active and involved parenting about being the pursuit of family advantage, improving circumstances for your family, that kind of instrumental element that underpins it. If we really think about the campaigns and particularly the pressures that campaigning created for parents, so the demands on time and energy and the strain that causes for family life, and there's lots of data that discusses this, about the way that they pull between the commitments to the families and so on and so forth, how tiring it is, and also particularly for the anti-academisation campaigns, the way that you are putting your head above the parapet, okay, that you are challenging people with institutional power who are also responsible for looking after your children's education. I think we can actually argue that campaigning in and of itself it actually works against families' immediate interests. It would certainly have been less stressful, less anxiety inducing, less strenuous for them not to have campaigned and just to have acquiesced to the demands of authority. So I think we see here another way in which the kind of, they book the kind of individualism around the norms of active and involved parenting. So we now want to take this to really home in on some of the experiences of parents campaigning. So our argument here is that basically the parents are enjoined to become active. They're subject to normative pressures to become active and involved. They are summoned to be active parents through policy, but just not too active, okay? And so what we want to look at now is, and we frame this in terms of Axel Honneth's kind of theory of recognition, what we want to look at now is what happens to those parents when they do become active in ways that aren't officially sanctioned or condoned. And just to qualify, the funding camp, basically the experiences of misrecognition of conflict, okay, and the contemptuous treatment that was meted out with parents is all around the anti-academisation campaigns. And there's an explanation for this. The funding campaign tended to work closely with schools and teachers, okay? But remember, the target is quite far away. The target is central government. So, it's kind of amorphous. There's less opportunity for conflict at the ground level in the campaigns there. Whereas with the anti-academisation campaigns, they're opposing people and the schools, the head teachers, the local authority, even the DfE itself, who have a vested interest in making sure that these schools become academised. So that proximity, that divergence between the interests, that proximity and the very urgency of the threat of academisation. I think it's this that explains why conflict was so prominent in the accounts of our anti-academisation activists. So our theoretical framing here is Honner's theory of recognition, which he draws primarily from the early Hegel and the social theorist George Mead. Okay, and his idea is that our sense of self depends upon recognition from others who we ourselves recognize. Okay, so this idea of mutual recognition. And he thinks that it is the experiences of being misrecognized that actually propel social change, that generate conflict and drive, for Honneth at least, in his kind of teleology, progressive social change, okay? And you can see that in the first quotation there. I've studied Hegel, I've studied Honneth before, but on revisiting this work, I was struck by the way, quite the prominent way in which misrecognition in Honneth's work and elsewhere is presented as being an affective issue. Misrecognition is affective. It's deeply emotional, okay? And this is exactly how our respondees, you know, spoke. John mentioned the passion earlier. These are felt experiences. They are powerful, they are passionate, and they hurt. And you'll see some of the ways in which the experiences of parents show how wounded, how hurt they were through their experiences. So this idea of disrespect or misrecognition, Missachtung, so however you want to translate it, it's translated variously as disrespect and misrecognition, is an effective relation, okay? And we see this coming through in the slides now. I'm just working out whether I think this is me. So on in terms of academisation, one of the kind of principles, although it's a bit of a sketchy area, is that schools or local authorities need to consult parents about whether to academise. They need to canvass parents' views and vote and get votes and all these kind of things. It's not legally binding, and there is some ambiguity about it, because I think officially the terminology is schools must consult with whoever they deem appropriate when considering to academise, okay? Now that could be parents or it might not be parents, okay? But in our cases, there were consultation exercises held, okay? And what tended to happen with these, or as parents reported, what tended to happen was that these consultation events were rigged in a way that stopped discussion, that stopped debate, okay? And there were suspicions that they were intentionally done to do so. And this, we see in this, I think, Honner's kind of, one of Honner's key aspects of misrecognition, which is to deny people the rights to participate in interaction, okay? So trying to prevent parents from airing dissenting views, trying to prevent parents to contribute, to speak, okay, is a way of denying them the opportunity to interact and denying them the status of equal partners with equally valid rights claims. And we see this in Mark from the Eastborough campaign here. They were just paper exercises. They were held at strange times. They weren't communicated to parents. And we see this echoed in other research as well, such as Stevenson's research, where, you know, it is a way of controlling the discussion, controlling the debate, and minimizing opposition. And we also then we get not just simply the attempt to like kind of deprive parents of the right to speak, the right to contribute, but we also get efforts to undermine and intimidate and belittle parents in a way that shows considerable contempt, I would argue, in a way that negates campaigners' own self-worth and value. Do you want to come in on this?
So this quote is another really, really powerful one, which tells us how it's not just about denying voice. It's not just about tokenism. There's much more severe things going on here in terms of misrecognition. At every opportunity, they tried to make us inferior by the wording they used on their reports, on their letters. some parents, a few parents, a small number of parents. No, we're not small actually, but you know, it felt like that was sort of manipulative and quite a bullying tactic. So these parents are really feeling those experiences of misrecognition. And what I like in the middle of that is that no, we're not small actually, because what you start to see then is a kind of a response that's generated in relation to that misrecognition. You get the starting point, the fueling of protest and resistance against these forms of misrecognition. Nathan, if we go on to the next slide, I'll keep going for a
Well,
while.
let me just come on this one actually, because this is really important. I think we've probably only got time to discuss the first one here because we're 35 minutes by my reckoning. But this is again an example of the belittling and intimidation of parents. And this quotation here, where we see Floyd was a parent governor at the time, and he's speaking here about being bullied in governors' meetings, not being allowed to speak, being shouted at. Okay, this is one instance amongst quite a few where our interviews themselves were punctuated with effect. Okay, so it's not just reporting back on feeling angry at the time. Floyd is actually angry now. He's angry in the moment. He's living it. He's angry. He's hitting the table. You can see his upset and his anger being directly emoted within the interview space. And I think it just reminds us of that the interview itself is an effective practice, okay? And we see here the doubling of emotion. We have both the reporting back on events and the emotion of the events, and the reliving, the re-experiencing of it. And when you consider the fact that Floyd came to Britain as a refugee from the civil war in Sierra Leone, and he's comparing his experiences unfavorably to that kind of his own personal trajectory, we really get a sense, I think, for how painful, okay, some of the experiences and the treatment that parents received here. John, you come in on the troublemaker.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Nathan. So one of the other kind of strands of this process in relation to how parents are mis kind of recognised is in relation to the way that they're reported by those people who they come into conflict with. So this quote: senior leadership at the school were actually trying to portray us as troublemakers and as bullies. We were called bullies. We were called all sorts. And again, you can kind of feel the anger coming out from Aaliyah's kind of comment there. Her comment kind of shows how these parents were kind of pathologized, they were demonized by those people in power, those people who they were challenging, and how that process kind of delegitimizes the way that these parents are feeling, and it discredits them. But again, this kind of shows how it's about the regulation of emotions, and that parents' emotions here are kind of being viewed as being outlaw, as being something that is wrong, that is pathologized, and it's seen as incompatible with the dominant order and the way that the schools were going through these processes of academization. It kind of shows us that parents aren't supposed to show their dissent, show their anger, show their concerns and those kinds of things. And if they are, then they get positioned as being problematic parents with these kinds of labels. But again, what we see in this research is that this didn't stop the parents from being activists. It just made them even more enraged and even more focused on their goals. Great. Over to Nathan for the conclusion.
Got 2 minutes,
we're coming in on time.
Well, I've got 2 minutes. And let me just say that these are incredibly active and involved parents. These are involved parents who are involved in their children's education, who are, even in this case here with Eastborough, taking the local authority to court. These parents have no experience of any of this kind, and they went to court and won an injunction stopping the local authority actually pursuing further academisation. So there's no way in which I think that we can deny the fact that these are active, involved parents. But what they are doing is shattering that kind of normative boundary, I think, around active and involved parenting. And I think we need, as a result, to really rethink what parental involvement means. Really think again about parents' right to collectively contribute to decision-making processes and actually work to legitimate action that is undertaken to secure that right. So not to pathologise, but to see and present and engage with these parents in different ways. And to do that, we need genuine spaces for parental participation, not just for the right to speak, but as John pointed out, the right to feel as well. So they have a right to feel angry about a decision that is being taken without their consent and which affects their children, okay? And I would argue that really parental activism is perhaps the very epitome of parental involvement because of the risks, the effort and so on and so forth that it takes, and the lessons for the children that they see as their engagement as being bound up with as well. But I think in many cases, the institutionalized misrecognition that the anti-academization campaign has faced, I think it actually was counterproductive, because what it did was serve to really drive parents even more. Okay, so that kind of contempt they experienced was counterproductive. It frustrated parents, it made them even more angry, and it made them even more dedicated to the cause that they were actually fighting. And that's it, thank you. Shall I stop sharing?
Whichever. I mean, they're beautiful slides, so leave them up, it's fine. Thank you so much for that. It's just so much food for thought, and as a parent, much of it resonates. And you know, it's what's, I guess, really shocking is how little things have moved on for such a long time. You know, some of that literature you were drawing on was from the 1990s, and yet we're still caught up in the same debates and the same issues, and that's really really troubling, actually, despite, you know, the kind of incredible work of parent activists, how little change is affected over time. So we have got a few minutes for questions, and people have been posting in the chat. So Sharon, you had a comment about special educational needs. Do you want to pose that yourself, or would you like me to present it?
Yeah, it was more a comment than a question, but it's just really, I was pointing out that within special educational needs, in current policy, there is a requirement for collective parent engagement through the parent carer forums. And I just thought I would point it out. I think there's a huge tension because it does sit in contrast to that sort of individual approach that is also prevalent throughout the rest of the code of practice. But yeah, I just thought I would mention it rather than have a question.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sharon. I'm just going to skip to Sid's point because I think it kind of connects in some tangential ways. He was asking about parental activism when it's not squarely to do with education or educational issues, but are to do with more kind of sociological issues, so anti-vaxxers or anti-trans campaigns. And what happens? Sid, do you want to address this question, or shall I carry on? I'll carry on. Okay. So yeah, how does your research kind of what light can it shed on how you know, media scare stories about child protection and so on, and imposing some sort of ideology, parental ideology that sits on the margins, how does that, what does parental involvement mean in terms of those more taboo or contentious issues?
I've got leaf blowing directly outside this window, so I'm going to try and thank you for the point about SEND. I'll have to check out that code of practice, because yes, that sounds you know, it's interesting. I think that there is that collective element worked into that. It'd be interesting to see in more detail in practice, you know, how that works within the education system, I think. But I'll definitely follow that up. As for the point around, you know, okay, so I've been seeing lots of the anti-vaxxer protests around schools, and there's been, I think there might have been some cases here with parents bursting into schools and serving writs and so on. I don't know, it partly depends, our interest is in educational activism. So it partly depends, I suppose, how we define educational activism. But I think more, I suppose, more directly pertinent to our case, which raises the same kind of issues, are the protests that happened around Birmingham and Manchester, around where the parental activism around the No Outsiders curriculum. Okay, and that is troubling and it is problematic. And we and John have spoken at length about the kind of issues that raise. And it is an example, quite clearly, of educational activism, parental activism in education. But I think we would broadly follow Honath here in the activism is normatively neutral in itself. Okay, so there has no value in itself. It's the end to which activism is put. It's the goals to which it is intended that are important. And obviously, so the way that you would morally or normatively judge, any particular case of parental activism in education would be in terms of the ends that it seeks. And those ends have got to be morally defensible. And in Honath's term, that would be serving to promote forms of recognition, whereas the No Outsiders program is obviously, denying recognition. It is yet another species of misrecognition. Maybe the issue needs it's more complex and it needs thinking out through in more detail, but I think that basic moral point is important, I think. I'm sorry, Sid, I know that I diverted it away, but I think probably some of those same kind of issues also imply in the kind of anti-vaxxer movement to which we're referring.
That does feel like a whole other humongous debate to get into. So maybe we just have to park that for now. But Angela has a couple of points, and just in the interest of time, unless you're desperate, Angela, to ask the question yourself, it was about the kind of unintended consequences or advantages or offshoots of parental activism, and what that can do in terms of bigger change in the school, or boosting parental confidence, and also providing role modelling of activism to children themselves. And she said that this particular student of hers, who was a parent, felt really chuffed and empowered for the movement, for both parents and children. So is that something that you unearthed in your research as well?
Can I let you come in on that?
Sure. So in the Eastborough example, there were a number of parents who had not been involved in anything like this before and didn't have the confidence, the skills, the capacity, and then suddenly they flourished going through these processes. One parent who was a postie, several other parents who weren't in professional jobs but found amazing skills to be able to do this work. And I remember sat in a cafe talking to some of the parents, and we were laughing about this because their campaigns went so well. They were now being approached by counsellors saying, you could be really good at doing this. And so suddenly they were thinking about versions of public civil kind of engagement that they never would have thought of before. And they were really interesting, amazing stories of families who had none of that history at all, actually. So in terms of that capacity building within individuals, within communities, we saw some really, really interesting examples of that.
And also, Angela, as well, they were quite explicit. All of the parents were quite explicit, and they wanted to be role modeling for their children. They wanted their children to see that their parents will fight and stand up for what they believed. And they saw it as an important lesson for their children as well. And that is across the board. I think that kind of data appeared across the board. So it's, this is educational activism in another sense as well. It is educating. They see it as being educational, as pedagogical for their children. Okay.
Can I just ask the flip side to that though? So as an activist and somebody who is not unfamiliar with standing on picket lines and making my voice heard, there's my children are sometimes keen and interested and other times utterly embarrassed and just like, oh God, why don't you just leave it alone? And if the thought of me being a sort of parental activist at their school it's just the stuff of sheer horror. And also the kind of coupled with that is when you're activist and you're investing all that energy and time in organizing yourself and being places and mobilizing, that's incredibly exhausting. So were these aspects that came out from your research?
Yeah, both of those aspects are clearly in the data as well, Jane. All right. So many of the parents spoke about mortifying the children find it when they come to school and those kind of things. But I think they're also, the parents are thinking about the future as much as anything else. But then if you take the funding campaign, for example, it was a very child-friendly, and it was family activism. Children were heavily involved, and from my observation, seemed to be really enjoying themselves in doing so. Okay, and we see that on the online campaigns as well. Now, I would be lying if there wasn't a strategic element that the parents admitted to as well. You know, they are very media friendly, photogenic, and so on. But I think there was both those elements, and particularly there was also that kind of family tension and so on around the campaigning activities. You're doing this all the time, and it creates, you know, you don't see your children enough, you don't see your family enough. So I think both of those elements were there, yeah.
Okay, Paula asks about other family members. So she's thinking specifically about grandparents or multi-generational input. Was there any evidence of that in your research?
So, to answer that question in a slightly different way, I was really surprised in not all of the campaigns, but in some of them, how it went beyond mums. Because we're talking about primary schools here, we're talking about mums at the school gate. And I thought it was really interesting how in a number of cases there were fathers and uncles who were like co-opted onto the campaigns. So that struck me more than it becoming an intergenerational series of campaigns. It was going out across the generation that those kind of links were being made. I don't know if you felt differently from your examples, Nathan.
No, but I'm very conscious. We spoke to people who we were put in touch with through our gatekeeper, and who were identified as and self-identified as core members. But these campaigns were much wider than the people that we spoke to, so we wouldn't be able to say with any certainty at all about the demographic makeup of the wider campaigns. Now, anecdotally, at least for the anti-academy, one of the anti-academy campaigns and the funding campaigns, it was primarily mothers involved, as reported by some of the members, for example. Although we know, and we interviewed fathers as well involved, but we wouldn't be able to say any further beyond that, really. But these were bigger campaigns, much bigger campaigns, and we've actually managed to speak to the people involved.
Okay. Yeah, one of the things I wanted to ask about, and maybe this kind of touches on what Angela's saying about emotional labour, but how you're conceptualizing affect, because it seems to me that it's coming from social psychology rather than anywhere else. Was that a fair kind of summation of how you're framing affect, because you're talking about affect and emotions almost interchangeably?
Yes, I follow, rather than thinking of affect as some kind of primordial non-discursive force. It carries elements of that, obviously, but I take the line more of Wetherell, Margaret Wetherell, and Crossley, I think, I can't remember off the top of my head, but Margaret Wetherell's idea of affective practice. In social situations, affect and the discursive and the affective come combined together. And I think that made sense for us. We see it in the bodily representations and so on, but it's also in the way that they cognize and think about and discuss their emotions. And I don't think it's easy or potentially possible to necessarily separate those.
It's just, final question, I think, and I can't see any others in chat, so I'm just going to take chair's privilege and ask you my own question, is about parental activism and how it goes on. I mean, as you've said, in the primary sector, early years primary sector, there's a way to engage children, as you've talked about, and it kind of has a carnivalesque kind of feel to it, and it's about making the placards and the cute kids writing and all of that stuff. But when you get to secondary school, I think what I've encountered as a parent of children at secondary school, but also from stuff I was reading from Stephen Ball and others, Diane Ray and so on, is how it becomes even harder to be a parent activist or when you're in secondary school, because those channels of communication and your opportunities to mobilize, resist, and coupled with this shame that you bring to your children by being that embarrassing parent at the school gate with the placards beer. So does it mean then that the regimes that are in place in secondary school just do not come under the same degree of scrutiny, resistance, pushback as is the case in primary and early years?
We have seen cases like at Pimlico recently where students protested, and I think I have seen some secondary school, but I think you hit the nail on the head there, and it partly explains why there's been such an explosion of parental activism over the last 10 years, because it is easier to mobilize parents at primary school, where you see just tactically and strategically, it's easier to mobilize. So as soon as the academies program starts turning its attention to primary schools, I think that explains it's, secondary schools rolled over quite easily in comparative terms. So I think that does explain it. I don't know how you even go. It's a question of scale, isn't it?
I think there's also something really interesting about the parents who we spoke to, because many of them were, because one of the emotional consequences of this is they become exhausted, and it's very difficult for them to continue to campaign, particularly when their campaigns get really, really large. So there was a number of cups of tea in the afternoon in people's kitchens talking about how they might create a legacy, how they might do handover for other kind of parents to take on board. And for some of those parents, they were saying, when my kids get to secondary school, that's the point at which I would like to exit from some of this and give it to the next generation of parents so that they can then take it on board. Which I think, that just reflects so much of how those individual parents experienced that journey and how frustrated and exhausted they became through doing it.
But I think it also speaks to the problem around parental involvement generally, doesn't it? Because this primary school is small scale, it's of a human scale and those kind of things. Getting parents in for coffee morning, getting them involved. So this is not just about parental activism. I think it speaks to parental involvement and engagement more broadly. You have these big, massive schools, where they're covered in bars and nobody can access and so on and so forth. And there's just a multitude of people. They feel like exclusionary places to parents, don't they, or whatever, whereas the human scale of the primary school, cheer, everybody's going in, yeah. And I think it hints at the problems in the parental involvement literature about engaging parents at secondary level as well.
Yeah, well, yeah. So much for us all to think about. Thank you to you both so much. A really fascinating and really important and very timely contribution to this seminar series. Thank you both. I'm going to have to say farewell to everybody now because our time is up, but that was awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.